UI controls. And today we're going to be talking about dashboards. And I'm going to show you how you can create one for the Windows desktop using some .NET UI controls and Microsoft Visual Studio 2022. If at any point you have questions or comments, please do chime in with the chat. We love to hear thoughts and feedback from viewers. But before I get to the coding, I also want to set the stage a bit. I'm going to go over some dashboard considerations and plan out what we're going to do to create our dashboard. So dashboards are essential to viewing and analyzing data in a quick and meaningful way. They provide the information to users in a way that the users can quickly understand the data, gain insights, and possibly make decisions. We typically think of dashboards in a business context, but the word's mostly associated with the dashboard in your car. When you're driving, you have to keep your eyes on the road. So the dashboard is there to efficiently provide information to the driver, such as the gas level, the speed, the headlight status, and various indicators for your engine, tire pressure, and so on. For a business purpose, the dashboard typically shows daily and quarterly metrics that visualize the status of something. So for example, you might be tracking employee productivity, customer transactions, visitors to your website, total revenue, or pretty much anything like that. And many times it's associated with money or the success of your business. But dashboards not only provide a snapshot of these metrics, they also provide analysis for you in the form of aggregation or the grouping of data points. You're typically grouping by something like a date or a person or a geographic location. They also can provide user interaction in the form of filtering and drill down, allowing the user to look closer at some segments of the data, or even filter out the noise that you aren't concerned with for this particular dashboard. What makes a dashboard different from just any software application is that the dashboard focuses on delivering quick insight to the user. It does not typically perform other business functions, like you aren't entering a new sale or invoice to the dashboard or editing the database files in the dashboard. And not saying that you can't. You could create an application that's everything in one, but that's not typically what we see in just a straightforward dashboard. So in essence, dashboards focus on the data visualization, the aggregation, the filtering, and the drill down. They're basically like live single-page reports. So I think in modern terms, like a dashboard is a report and often can completely replace the need for the static report documents that you think of when you think of reports. And a dashboard is typically contained in a single view or page on the screen. So, they can show a broader range of data, but they don't typically replace like a large 50-page report necessarily, depending on what you're trying to show. So how do we build dashboards in .NET? So dashboards are built with software and code. And since I'm going to be working with .NET, it means we're going to create the dashboard in Visual Studio. And I'm going to choose C# as the code language. But you should know that the most common dashboard technology today is probably a browser technology with something like JavaScript and HTML or ASP.NET. And the reason is because developing for the browser gives you the biggest reach for users. Your users can instantly view it on any device, any browser. And with straightforward authentication, you can keep it private for your enterprise only. But that's not what I'm demonstrating today. Today, we're focused on developing a dashboard for the Windows desktop. And there are some benefits to a desktop dashboard over the web. So for example, desktop applications typically have better interaction with the user's PC and better performance with the use of multi-threading. And you can run custom logic on the client side, which is sometimes harder with a web application in the browser. But you probably know more reasons than I do because you're here interested in this topic. So if you do have a reason for why you're interested in building a dashboard or why you're building an application for the desktop on Windows, let me know in the comments. I'd love to know feedback on what people are doing with .NET desktop technology. So aside from that, the next decision is, okay, you're making a dashboard for the desktop. The next consideration is which desktop platform do you choose? There's classic Windows forms, there's WPF, and WinUI. Those are probably the current three that I would consider. The WinUI is basically for or UWP if you're creating a Windows Store app. So do you want it to be launched and installed from the Windows Store, or treated like a Windows Store app even if you sideload it? The other two, Windows Forms and WPF, those both use Win32. So That basically means that they're just like a classic Windows application. They can run on, most Windows versions, and they're both in the same boat as far as support level. And they're both going to run on Windows 10, Windows 11, going back as far as like Windows Vista probably. It's unlikely that one of these would cease to exist before the other, but there are many subtle differences and reasons why you would choose one over the other. I'm not really going to go into too much detail on WinForms versus WPF, but basically what it boils down to, from my perspective, is people choose WinForms because they're familiar with it, and it's a bit faster to work with in Visual Studio with the design time. People who choose WPF might choose it because of the small improvements over WinForms, like the DirectX rendering. But my favorite reason is because it uses XAML. So XAML, if you're not familiar, is basically like the HTML markup for your user interface for all of Microsoft's latest, technologies, including WinUI. And XAML allows you to define the user interface in a very scalable, easy to understand way. It's easier to create a custom style. And most importantly, it easily supports the popular application structure known as MVVM. And the XAML platform is ideal for MVVM data binding. And that is something that we're going to sort of focus on today. So if you're not familiar with what MVVM means, it stands for Model View View Model. And it's a popular pattern to separate your application business logic from the presentation logic. And it helps maintain this clean separation between app logic and the user interface. But it also helps, address many other development issues like, testing and maintaining and scaling the application. So essentially, you can create all of your business logic and put it all into like the view model and the model. And then the view is completely separate. So you could essentially reuse your business logic across different platforms, across different applications. The main things regarding MVVM are the binding of the view elements to your view model. And then you put all your business logic there. This includes things like data binding to your collections and also the commands, like all the button actions. Like that logic typically takes place in the view model in a perfectly structured MVVM application. And this strategy would therefore eliminate all of that code that's in your code behind file. So if you're familiar with WinForms and WPF, there's the form or the window page has its own code file that's tightly attached to it. And that code there is so tightly attached to the user interface, it's basically unusable from other modules in your applications. Therefore, it's not as scalable and it's not as testable since it's not as organized. So the model and view model situation helps separate that. And then they send notifications to the view, and that's how they can connect and sort of let the view know that, hey, we update this, update that. And there are lots of libraries out there that help with MVVM. I think the most popular one is Prism, but really they're not required. From my perspective, if you just use the XAML data binding strategy, which I'm going to show you, as well as, you have to use the iNotify property changed interface in your classes to help pass those notifications to the view. That's like the bare minimum that you need for MVVM. So my coding demonstration will be a good, introductory level to, structuring an application to take advantage of this. And while it is possible to do MVVM in WinForms, it's just more naturally supported in the XAML platforms, such as WPF and WinUI. So since that's part of what I want to demonstrate today, that's part of the reason why I'm going to be building my dashboard in WPF. So another consideration that you're going to need for your dashboard or any application is the data source. I would say probably most of your time, 60 to 90% of development time is probably going to be spent around working with the data. The UI is easy, as you'll see, especially when you're using third-party controls. But outside of the application code, we have to be able to connect to some data source. And you should consider where your data is coming from and how you'll connect to it within your application. So for today's demonstration, I don't want to make this too complicated. So I'm going to be pulling data from this public Northwind data service that provides OData formatted data. So this just means the data is going to be sent through the internet using the formatted open data protocol. And you can use a variety of libraries and classes to accept and handle OData. ComponentOne does include a data service component, a data connector for OData, so I'll be using that. Now, the Northwind database is a classic database that's been there since the 90s. You'll notice in the dates, it's still dated from the 90s. It has many tables, and for this dashboard, I'm only interested in showing basically the sales results. So I'm going to be pulling in the orders and the order details so I can get the sales data. And I'm also going to be pulling in the employees just so that I have a way to sort of filter my dashboard by employee. So here's a mock-up of what my dashboard is going to look like when I'm done. So on the left, there's essentially two columns here. On the left is basically where I'm going to display my employees within like a drop down. I'm going to display the orders that are associated with that employee. And then when you click on an order, you'll get the order details and some sort of drill down master detail table situation. And on the right is going to be the data visualization. So in a real world scenario, you aren't typically just plotting raw data from the database. You're going to need to aggregate and sort of group the data, summarize it, to create, a compelling dashboard that provides information that would actually be useful for your users. So for the data visualization, it's not going to be displaying just the raw data from those tables. I'm going to be transforming it in some way. So I'll have to create some scripts in C# that will aggregate the data and group it and summarize it by things like country, order, and total price. So I probably should have clicked that earlier. So on the left here, we have the employees, the orders, the order details. And on the right, we have these three scripts. So we're going to show the total sales target for that employee. We're going to group the sales by country and then also the orders per month, because why not? So following that view model thing that I mentioned before, here's how I would structure this project with its various entities, just so we can get like a visual before we jump into the code. So our view is the user interface. It's going to consist of a combo box, some data grids, some charts, in addition to other UI things like labels and lines, whatever else. Those are really unimportant to the meat of the dashboard. And then the view model will expose various collections or lists that are of our business entities that we want the view to simply bind to. So this will have our 6 main collections or queries, the employees, orders, order details, but also some of the, what I'm calling the queried lists, the sales by country, orders by year, and those will be bound to the chart. So typically you want to manipulate and transform the data within your view model. The model is basically just the collection of classes that define each of our core entity items, like employee, order detail. And all of our C# code is going to be in the view model and the model. And the view will just be written in XAML. So now let me jump over to Visual Studio and let's start this demonstration. First, I'm going to show just sort of like a tour. So I've already created an application because I have some boilerplate stuff to save some time. But if you're new to Visual Studio, what you would do, new project, and WPF or WinForms application, and then you walk through, naming it, you choose if you want it to be .NET 6, .NET Framework, etc. So here I have a .NET 6 WPF application, and I've already gone ahead and created a model folder. And in my model folder, I have my employee class, which I've defined. These are all of the properties from the employee table. We have order. We have order detail. Now, what's interesting here is that what I'm going to do is I'm going to connect to my OData service and essentially populate a list. You can also, in this class, create your own like custom field, so to speak. So if you're familiar with the Northwind database, it has, for the order detail, it has the order ID and the product ID, which connect each line item. Then there's the price, the quantity, and the discount. So I'm adding a custom field here called total, which is the unit price times the quantity. Now, technically, maybe I should include the discount in that calculation, but for this demonstration, I forgot about that. And similar in my employee table, there's first name, last name. But if I want to display the full name, I can create and return my own custom field here. So what's nice about this is I'm putting this logic here in my model. This is not going to be in the view. Nowhere in my combo box or my data grid am I writing this logic. It's separated. Now, I also have a class here. Now, this is not specifically an MVVM friendly thing. This is just, every application is going to be different in how you connect to your data source. So here I've just created a static class for data source. And what this class is essentially doing is just returning me my collection of employees my collection of orders and my collection of order details from the OData service. And I'm using my the ComponentOne OData connector and just using it through code, creating a connection, and then opening the connection, reading it, and pulling in the data into a collection. Now, my strategy for my data source access is I'm going to basically just pull in these three collections at once, and then allow the filtering and the drill down and all the aggregation to happen on the client. There are other ways that we could do this. We could be querying. So rather than just select all the fields from employees, I could do my custom, work there, depending on what's supported with your data source. I don't think OData supports like complex joins and things like that. But depending on what your data source is, you could do all of that here. So that's that. And then next, I'm going to jump over to my view model. So here I've created a folder for view model, and I've added a view model class. Now this is like the main brain of my application. And in here, I've defined a collection of employees. And when employees is null, basically the first time the application runs, it now reaches out to my data source to pull it one time. And then when it's no longer null, it just returns that collection anytime that the view is going to need it without re-hitting the server. And then I also have order details and orders. And now for my view, which I could have created a folder and dumped this into it, but it's just loose in here. This is the one window that you get by default in a WPF application. The key to the MVVM data binding here is that we set the data context for our window to an instance of the view model. So at runtime, an instance of my view model will be created. And now what this allows me to do is all of my UI components on this view can now just bind to those properties that I have defined in my view model. Now, the view model is missing all of the queried stuff, which I'm going to add piece by piece here. We can get started by defining the UI here for my dashboard. So the first thing I want to do is I want to define the rows for the dashboard. So the row, if you remember the sketch, there were basically 3 rows. So I'm going to define 3 rows in my grid here. And I know that's, roughly, when you do this by default, all the rows are going to be equal. I'm going to make the first row to be a bit skinnier because it's only displaying like the combo box and something else. But we'll get to that later. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to go ahead and just add in a combo box. So I could actually drag that from the toolbox, but I can just type it in here, combo box. Now my combo box will automatically appear in that first row. And I'm also going to go ahead and add in an image. In the image, I want to show just a little user icon, which I've already added to my project here. It's a little PNG. We're going to add that there. I'm going to set the width and height of this image. And we're going to align it to the left and the center. So with XAML, you often have to set the vertical and horizontal alignment. I typically don't like doing it. I like letting the elements just expand to their parent container. But rather than creating like a stack panel or a grid within this row of the grid, I'm just going to space it out like that. And then my combo box, so that my combo box doesn't overlap that image, I'm going to set the margin. Margin and padding essentially give you that breathing room around the element. So I'm going to set the margin to, something so that it spaces itself away from that little icon there. So now all I have to do is to bind this combo box to my list of employees. I said item source property, and I use the binding tag here, binding, and then now I'll even get the IntelliSense, but because I've set the data context here in XAML of the things that I can bind this to. So the employees comes up, so I can bind my item source to my employees. Pretty cool. Next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and just add the next components here. So I'm going to use the ComponentOne Flex Grid to display my orders and my order details below the combo box. So I'm going to go ahead, I can drag this from the toolbox. Now, when you do it for the first time, you'll get sometimes in WPF you have to do it twice. The first time it's adding the NuGet package or the DLL, and then the second time, once it's already added to the project, then you drag it again, and then it works. In my case, I've already gone ahead and added the NuGet packages just so that I don't run into any issues. So I already have the NuGet packages in my project for the components I'm going to use. For the OData connector, the flex grid and flex chart, and as well as the gauge, which we'll get to. So I want this flex grid this one I'm going to allow to just fill the space. So here's a little tip in WPF. When you want it to just fill the space and you don't want it to be this hard-coded size, because one of the great things about WPF is it's so scalable. You're not typically using explicit sizes like that margin, 185, 189, that's not good. So I go down to layout and I hit reset all, and that just strips out all of that garbage. So now it's just filling that first row of my grid, but I actually do want to move it down to the second row of the grid. So I'm going to set grid.row equals 1. Oh. Now let's move down to the second row. I'm going to go ahead and add another flex grid and do the same thing for the second row. And if I drag it to the right spot, it might actually land correctly. There we go. Now I have a flex grid in the second row. Now for this flex grid, I'm simply going to, just like the combo box, I'm going to set item source. And the first one I'm going to bind to the orders. And then the second one, I'm going to bind to order details. All right, and that should be it. Now I should be able to at least run this application and see what we're working with so far. Fingers crossed. Now, so far, my view model is literally just spitting out the full collections. So we have not really wired up yet the drill down or the filtering that we're going to need. That's going to be next. As we can see here, it does appear to work. So I have my combo box. Oh, I did forget one thing, my combo box. I'll fix this. I forgot to set what we're going to display in the combo box. But here we can see we have the orders, the order details, those look correct. So let me fix that combo box issue. So once you're binding the combo box, you have to then tell the combo box what field is going to be the display and which is going to be like the underlying value. But here we just need the display member path. And I'm going to set this to full name, which if you remember, that was the custom property I created on the employee object that will combine the first and last name. I'm also going to go ahead and just sort of make this a little smaller so it doesn't look stupid. Okay. So we'll check that out. Next time I run the app, we'll check that out. But the next thing I want to do is I want to be able to start adding in that drill down, the filtering aspect. So the best way to do this the old-fashioned way to do this would be, okay, I'm going to handle my combo box click event. And then depending on which employee they click on, then I'm going to somehow pass that to the flex grid and filter it. That's sort of the old-fashioned way. But in the MVVM way, every single action thing we want to do, we want to try to treat it as like a bindable property on our view model. So what I'm going to do is go to my view model, and I'm going to create an object called my selected employee. So to save time, I did save some code snippets here, but I'm going to walk through how to, the logic for these code snippets. So here I've defined my selected employee, and this is essentially an employee object, and that's really all it is, just a get and set. And another key thing here that I need to mention is regarding the MVVM. Aside from the XAML binding, your classes like your view model implement the iNotify property changed, and all that does is it adds this property changed event here. And whenever you call that on a property, it basically sends that notification to the view like, hey, this thing has changed. Now the view needs to respond accordingly. So this is all I really need to do to set. This is the most basic type of like bindable property that we set on our view model. Now what I can do is go back to my view and bind the combo box to that. So how I'm going to do that is using its selected item property. So the selected item is different from selected index. The selected index is just a number. Selected item is going to give me uh, like my bindable object here. So I'm going to set this to binding selected employee. And I think I need to set mode equals two-way here. So two-way means it's also collecting the input, not just the display. And then I'm also going to set the selected index to 0. Now what that does is that just gives me a default 1 when it runs. That way it's not just like null. Now I could maybe, code my application around the null option, but I'm just going to let it select the first one for me. But that's not all. So what that's going to do is that, yeah, so behind the scenes now I'll be able to, set the selected employee, but my orders collection that I want to now be filtered based upon the selected employee needs to be modified. So I go to the view model to do that. So what I'm going to do is go down to my orders collection, and by default, so here I already have the commented out, but my orders collection, I was just returning a collection of the orders, but now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add this extra code here that says, hey, if the selected employee is not null, essential. So if it is null, I'm just returning the plain orders collection. But if it's not null, what I'm going to do is I'm actually now going to do a bit of a query on this. I'm now going to filter my employees my orders based upon the selected employee ID. Now this is all happening on the client side. We're not reaching back out to the server to get them. It's all just being done on the client. So now we can go ahead and run that, and we'll see the combo box finally working. So here you can see the combo box is working. Now, when I select one of these, what should happen is that the orders should be updated based upon the employee ID that I select. But as you notice, the employee ID is not changing. Now, I did this on purpose. There's nothing in my code that's telling the view that the orders has been updated. The reason is because I'm only changing the selected employee as I select this. So what I need to do is I need to take advantage of that notify property changed interface here. So anytime the selected employee changes, I want to notify the view that, hey, also look at my orders collection. So if I add the orders collection here, my selected employee, then the orders collection will change. As we wait for this to load. So now when I select one of these employees, you'll see that the orders are now being updated. Next, I want to drill down into the second grid here, but when I select an order. So I'm going to do the exact same logic that I just did. So instead of a selected employee, I'm now going to have a selected order. Now in the selected order, I'm also passing in an additional notify property change for my order details, because now when the orders change, I need to tell the view, hey, look at the order details again. We're updating that. Now my order details, I'm going to do the same thing where rather than returning the whole collection, I'm going to return a filtered version of that based upon the selected order. And I definitely wanted to use a code snippet for this because I'm terrible at remembering this kind of syntax on the fly, but this type of querying right there. So now the next step is I need to set that binding for the selected item on my flex grid, similar to the combo box. Okay. Order and equal two-way. So let's run this and see if this is working. And once this is working, the next step is going to be creating the second column of my dashboard. So here I'm going to select one of these employees, select one of the orders, and we can now see the order details is being filtered based upon which order we select. Now, of course, this dashboard would be improved if I added some labels to these data grids. Like maybe I need a big heading that says order details. I'm not going to worry about that too much right now. The next thing I want to do is I want to jump over to the second column of my dashboard. So for that, I'm going to first add another column here using the grid column definitions. I just have to define two columns. The default column needs to be defined as well as the new column. And these will just take up 50% of the space by default. But a little XAML trick, if you want, one of the widths to be like, say, twice the available space, you could set the width equal to 2x. That would give it like twice the space, or 3x to give it 3 the space. Or you could, of course, set it to like an explicit size, like 200 or something. But or auto, which would be automatic based upon the children within it. But for these columns, I'm going to let it just be the default. Now, the first thing I'm going to add at the top is a bullet graph control, which is part of the ComponentOne gauges collection. So let me find it in my toolbox here. So a bullet graph has a few properties that we can bind to. Not only does it have like a value, but there's also like a good value, a bad value, as well as the maximum, minimum. It's kind of like a little mini chart. So let me remove some of this sizing here. So by default, the bullet graph just has these hard-coded values: bad, good, target, value. What I want to do is I want to bind these to properties from my view model. So let's jump back to the view model. We'll go up to the top here. And now I'm going to create a property called total sales. And what that's going to do is essentially aggregate the orders based upon the selected employee and the selected employee, because we want the sales target. Yes, we want the sales target for the entire sales for that employee, including all of their orders. So what I have here is I have a property called total sales. And what that's doing is essentially cycling through all of the orders for that employee and totaling up the price. I'm also creating additional properties: the sales target, the sales bad value, the sales good value. For these, I'm just hard coding some values in: 50,000, 10,000, 100,000. I could, do a calculation and these could be based upon, dynamic data from the data set. But in my case, I'm just going to hard code them for this example. Now what I want to do is go back to the view and bind all these properties from my bullet graph to those properties in my view model. So we're going to bind the value to sales target. We're going to bind the target to, the value is total sales. Target is sales target. And then bad is sales bad value. Good is good value. So when that runs, that should work. But I'm going to go ahead and jump down to the next one. We're going to add a chart, a pie chart, that's going to show the sales by country. And for that, I'm going to add a flex pie control to my window here. So I'm going to look for that in the toolbox. And the flex pie is also part of the flex chart or the WPF chart library. So for this, let me reset the layout here. Now, sometimes you get like these default things added to it. I don't want these default pie slices that are all just hard coded in here. But I could actually I could if all my pie slice values were independent properties on my view model, I could bind each one of them here, but I'm not going to do that. I just want to set the item source equal to a bindable collection, which I will add next. Let me also go ahead and add in my flex chart, which is going to be for the bar chart below that. For this one, look, I'm doing all these different approaches for clearing out the sizing. So I've created those components. They now exist on my window. Now let's jump to the view model and add the queries that these are going to bind to. So here I have a query, sales by country. And what this is doing is it's basically running through the selected employee and going through the orders and then doing some crazy logic to, sort them and group them by the country. Now, this is a very brute force approach, something that you would do, without the help of any additional libraries. ComponentOne does have an additional library called the data engine, which helps with this sort of thing. And I was planning on possibly demonstrating that today, but I'm going to save that for uh, a future stream, looking at the data engine and how it can make data aggregation really easy. But it's not really that complicated if you're used to writing code. I also have one for the orders, which is essentially counting the orders based and grouping them by year and putting them into a collection. And another key thing about this is that these are using dynamic objects. So a dynamic object is something that I'm really, it's kind of new for me even. And so essentially in the MVVM pattern, and even with the ComponentOne controls, you typically bind it to an object, right? So we have our employee object or order detail. But in this case, the chart needs to be bound to something that has, like, say, for example, if we're doing the orders by date, I need, a field to be the year or the date, and I need a field to be the total for that date. And I can't just use those existing entities, order detail. They don't match. They don't work. So I have to create another class. Now I could create a whole other class called counted orders, and it has a couple properties like the year, the total per year. And then I could populate a list with that object. But by using a dynamic object, I'm able to just create it on the fly and I don't have to manage and maintain it. So essentially here I'm creating a list of dynamic objects. And literally right here is where I'm defining what those properties are. There's a property for year and there's a property for count. And that's it. Like, those properties are not defined anywhere properly or officially. And so it can be a little complicated. I know that the data engine library helps, using these types of dynamic classes. And the same thing down here with sales by country, we're creating a dynamic list of objects. And the dynamic list is giving us properties such as country and total sales. So this is what I need to know, because these are the properties I'm going to be binding my charts to, the various axes and things. Of course, the collection will be these collections, sales by country and tracked orders. So let's go over to the view. And we'll start with the flex pie. And here we're going to set the item source binding to sales by country. Oops. So that will give it the flex pie, the collection. But now I need to tell the flex pie what to do with those properties. If you remember, we had, I believe there was country and then there was total. So I need to set the binding name, which is just the specific property for FlexPy that represents the different sort of slice dimension. We're going to set that to country. And then straight up the binding property to total sales. Or was it just total? No, okay, total sales. I see. So by default, these were set. That's the problem. Let's get rid of the duplicate setting there. Now what's the problem? All right, that looks good. Now onto the flex chart. Flex chart, we're going to set its item source to one that I called tracked orders. Now for the Cartesian chart, there's an X and a Y. So for the X, we're going to set it the binding X to the year. We'll also set the chart type to column, assuming that wasn't already set. Now the Cartesian chart can support multiple series. So in order to set the binding for the Y dimension, we have to first add a series. I could do that through the property grid over here. You find the series, open up the collection editor, but I'm just going to quickly just type this in here. Open up the series collection, define a series. Here I could define multiple series. I only need one. And for this one series, I'm going to set the binding, which represents the Y dimension, to count. I can also set the series name, and this will just be used for what's displayed in the legend. For count. Now, before I run this, there's one last thing I'm going to need to do, and that is, I need to notify my view when to update these, when to essentially get these. And what I'm going to do is essentially I'm going to update these charts whenever the selected employee changes, is when I'm going to refresh the chart based upon the employee. That could be different. I could maybe do it by other dimension, some other action in my application. So let's just do this here. Sales by country is going to be there. Tracked orders we want to update. Oh, as well as the sales target for total sales. Yep, total sales, sales by country, tracked orders. All those things will be updated whenever the selected employee changes. And then the view will be notified of that and perform all those actions. So now let's go ahead and run this. Apologies for my computer going a bit slow today. Visual Studio kept hanging there a bit ago, and that was making me nervous. So here we have, let's see, there's something weird going on with that. All right, I messed up the bullet graph. We'll take a look at that. But as I select the employees, you can see that the charts are updating. Based upon that, I can select my orders to get the order details. I have my FlexPy, my Flex chart here. And notice how I didn't write any code behind in my XAML file. Everything is being sort of manipulated through the view model. I would like to fix that bullet graph. What did I do wrong? Oh, you know what? Another dimension I probably need to set is the max value. Yeah. Another thing I want to do before I run this again, so the max value essentially, since my the values were so large, the max default's probably something like 100, and we're dealing with like hundreds of thousands. So that's probably why. Another thing I want to do is I want to just add some quick animation to these charts just for fun. So the flex charts and flex by, they do support um, animation. So you can have the animation work on load or update or the axes. So because we're essentially reloading each time, I need to use the load animation. Uh, it does support, if you're just updating the data points, you could use the update animation. And the update animation is pretty impressive because it just animates between states. Um, so I just quickly set that through the animation settings in the property grid there. And we'll run this one last time. And like I said before, for this dashboard, before I would complete this, I would also add in a bit more labels and things. I think it's a bit, I probably would add a label that says, this is the total sales, this is the order details. I kind of just skipped over all that. So here I can select the employee, and you can see the animation's a little slow. My computer's running a bit slow. And the animation can be customized. You can set the duration, you can set the easing function to change the way that it animates. Of course, I could change the palette of these things to make it a bit more coordinated and colorful. But that basically completes my dashboard. So if you have any questions or if any comments you'd like me to address, now is the time to enter it, because we're going to be wrapping up in a few minutes here. And of course, as I mentioned, the components that I use here are from the ComponentOne WPF edition. The bullet graph, the FlexPy, flex chart. I also use our OData connector. So do we have any questions? All right, it's looking like we don't have any questions. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap up today's stream. So thank